Well, good morning. Looks like we've got the faithful few here. I wanted to just mention, for those of you who may be watching online, last week we had trouble getting the stream to take, but the class was recorded and has been posted, so it's available on both Facebook and YouTube if you were not unable to see last week's class. Excuse me. Thank you, Connie.
You're welcome.
Last week we arrived at sort of a turning point in the text, and that was at the end of chapter 12. So we want to take just a few minutes here to sort of reposition ourselves and be sure we understand where we are and why this is such a significant shift in the emphasis of the book right now. Jesus has just arrived in Jerusalem for Passover. He had a grand entrance that we know of as the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He was welcomed as a king at a moment of great celebration and optimism and hope and encouragement. But we also saw that his entry into the city was somewhat misunderstood, because while they were proclaiming him as king, they really didn't understand the nature of his kingship or his kingdom. And as he entered the city, the picture of the king coming in on a donkey colt is sort of, it doesn't fit. And that's intentional, because we are to see that Jesus is introducing a different kind of a kingdom. And when we talk about moving into chapter 13, that's going to become so obvious you can't miss the point. But meanwhile, after this grand entrance into the city and this incredibly public welcome of Jesus, there's all these rumors of his power that are spreading. And this is especially true since he has just raised Lazarus from the dead. And so the stories of Jesus are everywhere. And this has made the local leaders in Jerusalem and the national leaders, both religious and political, it's making them nervous. And they're getting concerned about how Rome might react to this. And so there's great fear and trepidation on their part that they're going to lose their position as the leaders. They're going to lose their power. And so both Jesus and Lazarus have had contracts placed on their lives, essentially. They figured they'll just try to eliminate the people causing the problem. In addition to that, John, at the end of chapter 12, gives us a progress report on the spiritual side of the mission. And Jesus has now, in the words of John, completed the first task of his ministry. And that was, Jesus came to reveal God to the entire world. And John says this has by and large been done. And we'll see this also in chapter 14 when Philip said to Jesus, he said, "Lord, show us the Father. Show us the way to the Father." And Jesus said, replied to him, "Have I been with you this long and you don't yet see it?" Because it's there. And so Jesus has already given this side of the ministry, the important side of what he was needing to accomplish in human form. This side of the task was relatively complete. But now, whoops, I didn't mean to go there. Now he turns his attention to the second task of his ministry, which is that of saving mankind. And what this involves is now he's going to have to go through the self-sacrifice that is laid out for him. He will have to be what we read about all the way back in John chapter 1, where the Baptist said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." That task is still in front of Jesus, and that's now where the attention begins to turn, okay? And so we begin to focus now on the death that Jesus will experience. In the terminology of Jesus, the light is about to go out. That's about and he said this several times. Darkness is upon us. It's about ready to be here and, follow the light, be children of light, be sons of light while you have that opportunity. And so now, John records these words of Jesus as he prepares his disciples for what will soon be upon them. John no longer reports on the masses, the crowds, the interactions with his opponents. That part of the gospel is behind him. Now the focus, he zeroes in on his disciples. And there are three main goals that Jesus has that he needs to accomplish with his disciples. First of all, he needs to help them understand what's about to happen, because they're going to be confused. They are confused, and they're going to continue to be confused until they can look back and see what the whole thing meant. There's going to be a period of great confusion for them. They're not going to understand why he has to die. They're not going to want him to die, even though we look back at it now and it seems obvious to us. It seems, that his purpose was in doing that. But to them, they didn't understand it. They didn't understand it yet. Secondly, Jesus has to prepare them. He has to prepare them for the fact that he will no longer be with them. There is going to be a major change because they've been basically living, traveling, preaching, ministering together for most of the previous 3 years. And that's the life they have taken on now. But it's all going to change. Everything is going to change. And then the third thing that Jesus has to do is he has to equip them. He has to give them the tools that they will need in order to be successful in carrying the mission forward. And those are the three priorities that we are going to see emphasized now, really through the rest of the book, but especially in these next few chapters. Chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, as Jesus has this long evening together with them, and they talk about the nitty-gritty of all these different details. Excuse me for 1 second. So, John has several points of emphasis now that he shifts to, and these are the things we need to be watching for as we work our way through this text. First of all, what is coming is part of God's plan. This is not an accident. It's not the others taking control away from God. This is the way God intended for it to be, and it will result in his glory, in his glorification. This word glory is just all over everything in these next few chapters. You're going to see glory, glorified, glorification. It's all over the place. And even though they cannot see it or understand it yet, they will later understand that this all fits in with what God's intention has been from the beginning, and that Jesus is indeed fulfilling what he needs to do. This is where we look back at it sometimes and we think it's so obvious, but it's because we've seen the rest of the story. They hadn't seen it yet, and they just had no way of knowing what the intention was and what the purpose was and how this would all fit together in the end. They just had to take it on faith. Secondly, John emphasizes the fact that Jesus will soon be departing and they'll be separated. The success or failure of the mission is going to be transferred from Jesus to these fledgling disciples. And the degree of success or failure that they have is going to determine the ultimate success or failure of the whole enterprise. And so it all is resting on them. And Jesus is going to provide them with some special help. And we're going to learn about that as we go through particularly chapters 14, 15, and 16 too. There will be new help provided in a new way. Then there's a new principle that will guide the kingdom and will become the rule of the kingdom. And that principle is love. These chapters also just drip with love all over the place. And we think of John as the apostle of love. This tells us that this teaching, this time as Jesus is preparing them, this really rubbed off on John. He saw it up close, and personal, and it makes all the sense in the world to him. And so that is the man that he becomes. That's the apostle that he becomes, is the apostle of love, ultimately. And then the last thing we're going to watch for as we work our way through, not the last thing, but another important thing that we're going to watch for as we work our way through this text is, let's remember where the real battle is here. The battle is not between Judas and Peter. The battle is between God and Satan. That's where the battle really is. And they're both using humans for their purpose. But that's where the battle rests. It's a spiritual battle, and it's a battle between, as Paul would say, it's a battle between principalities and powers. This is not just a superficial skirmish. This is a spiritual war for all of time. And so, with that, we move into Act 2. All right? Last week, remember, I wrapped up saying, okay, the curtain falls on Act 1. Now we move into Act 2. And Act 2 is focused on the disciples and what's coming and getting them ready for it.
You know,
Mark?
it's interesting that you mentioned the spiritual battle, because this whole thing started in the garden of the spiritual battle, a proclamation of a spiritual battle, and now you see how it's, you know, it kind of got lost a little bit in the Old Testament, but it's really coming to a head now, and you can see that clearly.
It's coming right back into focus, isn't it? I don't know if you've seen the movie The Passion, the Mel Gibson thing, but there's that scene, remember, about the snake showing up here. And that's one of the things we think of, is that, yes, the influence of Satan is so obvious in this story and where we are getting to in this story, as now Jesus is preparing to fix that which has been broken for centuries. Okay, so now we're gonna move our way into chapter 13. And once again, we are immediately struck by how John's description of this evening is completely different from the description of Matthew, Mark, and or Luke. And what he tells us, if you didn't know better, you wouldn't know they were the same event, because there's that much difference. The only things that they really share in common are they both talk about the betrayal of Judas, and they both talk about the denial of Peter coming. But aside from that, the accounts are completely different. John mentions nothing about the actual meal itself, the meal that they shared together. He mentions nothing of the Lord's Supper or Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper. That is not what John's priority is. Instead, almost all of the emphasis that John places on this evening is an object lesson that Jesus taught. And that object lesson doesn't show up in any of the other accounts. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have left it out. So John is the only one that gives us this event. And as always, he has a very specific thing in mind that he wants to communicate here. Don't forget, though, that as John tells this side of the story, the rest of the story is already out there. Everybody knows it because Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels have been written, they've been circulated, everybody knows it. So everybody has the details of Matthew, Mark, and Luke available to them, and they already know that. But they don't know what John is going to drop on them now. And so he's able to be selective in terms of the details that he gives. Now, in chapter 13, we're going to see these three sections. It begins with the object lesson itself, which is an exercise in foot washing. Okay? And then in verses 18 through 30, we see Judas, the betrayer, is dismissed to go do his dirty deed. And then in verses 31 through 38, Jesus begins his talk of farewell, which will continue for the next several chapters. So we start here in John 13, 1 through 17. And this story is well known to us. We know this story. We've paid attention to us. But here's the question as we read through it and as we begin to look at it. I want you to ask yourself, why is this so important in John's narrative? Why is it so important, A, that Jesus did this, and B, that John needs to share it? Why is it so important? And so we'll start here with chapter 13, verses 1 through 3, and John will set the scene and set the situation for us. So let's take a look, first of all, at verses 1 through 3. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. And having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he had come from God, and that he was returning to God. And we'll just stop right there. That sets the situation for us. What does John tell us about the location of this? Well, not much at all. All we really know is that he's still in Jerusalem. According to the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this was in an upper room. And there's been a lot of speculation about whose upper room this was. And it's all speculation, but just sort of a fun exercise. Some people have thought that this may have been a room that Nicodemus owned. There's some indication that Nicodemus was a very wealthy man. We know he kept company with Joseph of Arimathea, who was also a very wealthy man. So it's possible that this could have been Nicodemus's place. Another thing that's floating around is that perhaps this was John Mark's mother's home, Mary, because over in Acts chapter 12, when Peter's in prison, the disciples meet at Mary's home to pray for Peter. And so that thought is out there too, that perhaps this is a place where the disciples met periodically. They may have met here for this meeting. We see them meeting together again after the resurrection when we get to chapter 20 of John. And then we see them meeting in a room, an upper room in Acts 1 when they're preparing to replace Judas as an apostle, and they're together in prayer. And then over in Acts 12, they meet again. So maybe these are all tied together in the same location. Maybe they're not. The reality is we don't know, but it's just maybe a little bit fun to wonder. What does John tell us about the timing of this event or the chronology? Well, verse number 1 tells us that Passover is now upon us. So that's when this is taking place. Verse 1 also tells us, and this is something we alluded to last week, verse 1 also tells us that the time has come. The time has been fulfilled. And this should remind us of what we talked about last week in chapter 12, verse 23, where Jesus, when he began to speak publicly in Jerusalem after entering the city, he said, "The hour has now come for the Son of Man to be glorified." So this stands in contrast to what John has been saying all through the gospel up until this time, where he kept saying, "My time is not yet come." Jesus' time was not upon him yet. So this has been repeated, and now in chapter 12 and chapter 13, his time has arrived. So we know that this is the time that had been chosen for him by God. We also know that this was, according to verse 3 now, the evening meal. And in all likelihood, that is the Passover meal that is being described, because that was what was set up back in verse 1. So we have the location being an upper room in Jerusalem. We have the timing being the Passover meal. What about the situation? Well, John tells us that Jesus was aware of several realities. And we need to understand this because this is why Jesus takes the action that he does. And the Bible tells us that. First of all, verse 1, it says Jesus knew that he would soon be leaving and going away from those that he called his own. He would be leaving them. Verses 1 and verse 3 tell us that he realized he had come from God. That was his origin. He'd come down from the Father. He had descended to earth. He'd done all that stuff from Philippians 2, where he'd humbled himself and took the form of a man and has been acting as a servant. he realizes where he has come from, but he also realizes he will be returning back to his Father in the near future. So there are some things that Jesus is aware of, and John wants to be sure that we understand that. The other thing that he tells us, according to verse 3, is that Jesus is aware that he has the full authority from his Father. And you see that in verse 3 when it says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. So there's these important things that Jesus understands as he's about ready to take this next step. And John also tells us that Judas is in place too. Judas is ready to go. Judas has arranged what he's going to arrange. And so that's all set. It's all set and ready to go. So, where are we at by the end of verse 3 and the situation is drawn? Well, number one, the battle lines have been drawn. And as we said earlier, the battle lines are really between heaven and Satan. And those battle lines are ready. Number two, there's really no mention here of Jesus taking into account his suffering or how he's going to have, what the price is he's going to have to pay. That is not part of the equation. That is not why he takes this next step. He takes this next step because he has full power, because he came from God, and because he's going back to God, speaking of the fact that he is again acting on the direction of his Father. And that's his only interest in this, is meeting the direction of his Father. It doesn't matter the cost and what it will cost him. Certainly he's aware of it, but that's not part of his thinking. That's not part of his equation. The next thing we need to see from this passage is there's a contrast that we see described. And this is in verses 1. Yeah, it's verse 1. Notice, Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world, having loved his own who were in the world. You see how he's painting that separation? Jesus is getting ready to leave the world, but those he loves are in the world. And they're going to be in the world. So even though Jesus is needing and has to take these steps and make these decisions now, these others will have to follow in his footsteps later. Okay? Because they are going to be continuing in the world. And then maybe the most important thing that we want to see as John sets the scene for this is look at verse 1 at how he describes his love for those he will leave behind. And the translation of verse 1 is ambiguous. And what I mean by ambiguous, it can be carried out two or three different ways. The NIV, I'm going to go first with that because that's the one that I read to you a few minutes ago. The NIV focuses on the intensity of Jesus' love because he says he now showed them the full extent of his love. He showed them how much he loved them. Okay? It's interesting to me, and I've always looked at that and I've thought, what Jesus is going to do in this upper room is going to show them the full extent of his love, even more than his crucifixion. But that's what the text says. This is about to show them and demonstrate the full extent of his love. That's amazing to me. And you need to think about why that might be true, that this in some ways shows his love in a way that even his self-sacrifice of his life doesn't demonstrate for us. So we'll come back to that later. But that's an interesting and challenging thought. Other translations, the ASV, the ESV, the King James, the more literal translations, instead of focusing on the intensity of Jesus' love, they focus on the duration of Jesus' love. And the translation here is more like he loved them to the end. Not meaning that there's an end point to his love. That's not what he means. It just means his love continues no matter how long. Okay, so he loves them as long as life exists, as long as time rolls. As long as that happens, Jesus demonstrates his love. And so in reality, as we've said before, remember when we went through chapter 3 and we looked at how Jesus described the new birth? And there's two translations there. There's a translation that says you must be born again, but there's also a translation that says you must be born from above. And both of those are legitimate translations. And I think these are intentionally ambiguous. They are ambiguous so that we will include both of those ideas. And I think the same is true here. These are both legitimate, but they're also both ideas carry spiritual meaning. Jesus is now showing them the full intensity of his love and how much he loves them, but he's also going to show them that his love is going to continue until whenever. You can just count on it continuing. So I think both of those are important points. Well, in verses 4 and 5, we see Jesus actually taking action now. And we see the event described in John's words. So, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And then jump down to verse 12, because that sort of finished. There's an interruption here, but we finish the event down in verse 12, when the text reads, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. And with this now, we see Jesus focusing his care and his attention on his disciples. They have 100% of his interest right now. Verse 4 begins with the word so. And that's a linking word. And it tells us that the reason Jesus took this action was that he knew where he came from, he knew where he was going, and he knew that he had the full support of his Father. And there's a lesson for us in that. The lesson for us is that the way God has treated us in the past, the way God makes promises that he will keep for our future, those are the things that allow us to step out of our comfort zone and do that which is sacrificial for other people and beneficial for other people. That is how service is rendered. It's because we know how God has treated us in the past and how he will treat us in the future. Because we know that, we can serve no matter what. And that's the lesson that we're going to see here. Also in verse 4, we see a phrase that says, Jesus got up from the meal. This is an intentional interruption of the meal. The meal's just flowing forward. We're going to talk about this more later on, but a lot of Passover was scripted. You know, there were certain things you did, things you said, things you read, songs that you sang, certain prayers that you offered, and it was all sort of this script. Jesus interrupts it. This is a change, and this is important. Jesus got up from the meal. This is not like the slave who might have washed their feet when they walked into the room that evening. The dinner had already started. If a slave had done things, it would have been done in the doorway entrance. It would have been done secretively almost. It would have been quiet. The slave probably wouldn't have even lifted his head to look at the face of any of the guests who were present. The slave would have done his business and then slunk off into the corners and taken up his or her station as serving the meal. They would have been invisible, basically. Not so here. Jesus does not take an invisible position at all. He interrupts the meal to do this thing. Now, something I had never put together, and this is one of those goosebump things. Yep. This is one of those goosebump things, is what has the conversation been around the table that evening? If you need to look it up, you can find it over in Luke. What's... Who's the most important here? Who's the greatest? That's the discussion that's been going on. You can see that in Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 30. A dispute had actually broken out amongst the group. Who is the greatest? And maybe this originated because they had to take their seats. And seating charts were important. It's kind of like when you get into, you watch these documentaries of life in the royals and what's going on in the halls of royalty. And boy, they got a ruler out. They're measuring where the plate goes, where the fork goes, the spoon, the 18th spoon, and where these people sit at these affairs is important. This was true in Jewish society too, and it was true at Passover. And so perhaps as they're figuring out, okay, I want to sit there, I want to sit next to Jesus, maybe that's how this dispute got started, was over the seating chart. And now, Jesus lectures them and shows them this example about serving one another. It may also be true that Jesus hijacked one of the Passover traditions as he makes his point here. There's a time early in the Passover meal, as they celebrated it in the first century, there's a point where the host, the most important person at the meeting, at the meal, gets up and ceremonially washes their hands. And they are doing that for everyone that's present, and they're supposedly getting themselves clean so that they can be in a clean relationship with God as they eat the Passover. And there's this ceremonial minute. It's possible that this was the moment, the very moment that Jesus now, instead of doing this ceremonial thing where he looks self-righteous, instead he gets down on his knees and starts washing feet. Wow. Is that a powerful moment or what? And then there's one more thing that I want you to see here, and this is that there's a connection between these verses and what we read back in chapter 10. In chapter 10, Jesus was talking about being the good shepherd. And in verses 17 and 18, here's what he said. He said, "The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." And now in John 13, as we read this description of what Jesus does, in verse 4 and verse 12, he begins this by taking something off, and he ends it by putting something back on. And these words that are used here are the exact same words. And so John wants us to see this connection, this link. What's the significance of the linkage? Why does John want us to see that this connects with Jesus laying down his life? They're both his acts of ultimate sacrifice. He takes off himself and then puts it back on. Isn't that an amazing thought? Yeah. All right, so that's what we see happening in verses 4 and 5. Now, in verses 6 through 11, Peter objects. Watch for the shock in Peter's mind as we read about his reaction here, and we read this section of the text. And then watch Jesus and Peter go back and forth. Follow these words, you and I. And watch how Peter shoots first, and then Jesus shoots back. Okay? Watch the interplay between you and I. Here we go, verses 6 through 11. Jesus came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't realize right now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A man who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said, not everyone was clean. Verse 6, Jesus comes to Peter. Peter's next to have his feet washed. Peter objects. Notice how Peter addresses Jesus. He uses that word, Lord. It's a word that we use casually far too often. But Lord is an important word. And the Lord of this company should not be washing feet. He has no business washing feet. He is the Lord. Okay? And he should be having his feet washed. That's exactly right. Verse 7, Jesus says, "I know what I'm doing, and you will too eventually." I know what I'm doing, you will too eventually. And Peter, in truth, is not going to understand this until we get to chapter 21. And then we're going to see Peter, all of a sudden, the full realization is sinking in as to what his place is. In verse 8, nobody likes to be told that they don't get it. And especially not Peter. And so now in verse 8, Peter objects strenuously. And you may recall that phrase from A Few Good Men, the movie. He objects strenuously. The word never, when Peter says you will never wash my feet, it means not in all of eternity. This is never going. Another word that we tend to use casually. It's not a casual word. This can never take place. And so Peter's misunderstanding here was profound. But Jesus comes right back at him, and he gives Peter a spiritual ultimatum. He says, it's all or nothing. It's all or it's nothing at all. You're either all in or you're not in at all. Verse 9, once again, Peter thinks he understands, but he doesn't. And he thinks that Jesus is talking about Peter's cleanness. Maybe not his physical cleanness, but his spiritual cleanness. And I need to be washed by Jesus. And so he says, I'm all in for that. Give me all of that. I need it. Verse 10 is a little confusing. Why does Jesus talk in verse 10 about bathing? In contrast to foot washing. And these are different things because they're two different Greek words. The word that's used for bathe is a word that's washing the whole person. The word that's used for the foot wash is a word that's just for a limited cleansing. They are missing the point. And Jesus wants them to see the application he's making and not to miss it. And what Peter is experiencing is probably what everybody else in the room is experiencing too. It's just that Peter, as always, vocalizes it. He says it. He shows it. Jesus says this is not about getting your bodies clean. It's not even about getting your spirit clean because you're clean. You're clean except for one of you. But you are already clean. Your hearts are in the right place. What this is all about is washing feet. It's all about humble service. It's about doing something for someone else. That's what this is all about. And as I am doing it to you, you need to do it for others. That is where Jesus is going here. What is it that Peter is struggling with throughout this encounter?
Allowing God to humble himself and wash his feet. And it doesn't make sense because he's Lord.
Allowing God to do it his way. We've seen this through the gospel all over the place, but usually this has been Jesus' opponents who have preconceptions that won't allow them to get behind Jesus. Now we see that those same types of preconceptions get in Peter's way. Peter is struggling with this. You can't do this, Lord. You can't act like this. You are the Lord. This is not your job. This is not your function. And this is going to continue. He's going to question how Jesus can die. He's going to cut off a guy's ear because he thinks that'll help him win the battle. You know, there's so many things that are going on here, but John is showing us that even those disciples upon whom the church was built, even those disciples have not yet gotten their heads straight. And it won't happen yet. It's going to be later, but it will take place. So Jesus says to Peter, stop opposing everything that doesn't fit with the way you expect and want it to be. Stop getting in the way. And in fact, over in Luke, it says, get behind me, Satan, right? Satan is operating here just as he operated in Judas. Okay, we get to verses 12 through 17, and now Jesus explains what he has just done. Now I want you to go back and recall our earlier question. Why is this so important? Even in some ways more important than the crucifixion in terms of what Jesus wanted to show. He has just shown them the full extent of his love. Well, 12 through 17 should give us the answer. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. In verse 12, Jesus returns to his rightful place at the table, and he challenges those present to explain what he has just done. In verse 13, Jesus claims to be both teacher and master. Both are terms filled with authority in Jewish society. You don't see it so much in America, but when I was teaching in the residency program, and we had residents coming from all over the world, particularly those from foreign backgrounds. We had residents who came from Africa, we had residents who came from the Middle East, we had residents who came from the Far East, China, Japan, Philippines, and then also some from Eastern Europe. It's a whole different type of pecking order. A teacher, there is nobody more important than a teacher in those lives, and that is very significant. And that is the type of respect, that is the type of authority that Jesus claims here. He says, I am your teacher and Lord. As a teacher, he gives them knowledge, he gives them instructions, he gives them information that they must take action on. And as a Lord, he has the authority to give them commands and give them orders. And they cannot even question those things. They are to do them. And so now he claims both of those titles as he says, this is what I expect of you. He says, I have set you an example. Many people have taken, many groups, many religious groups have taken this example of foot washing and turned it into a sacrament. John himself, Jesus himself says, this is my example. This is not something you do every time you come together so that you turn it into a ritual. That is not the point. The point is to see those opportunities for you to sacrifice yourself for the benefit of somebody else. That is what this is all about. And that, in some ways, that helps us explain why this is so significant to both John and Jesus, and why they tell the story, and why John said all the way back in verse 1, this shows the full extent of his love. When Jesus went to the cross, there's a lot of fame and notoriety that's going to come out of that experience. There's no fame coming out of him washing feet. This is just a grungy dirt job. And we can think about all the difficulties of the crucifixion, but there's some glory in that. There's some glory in the crucifixion. There's no glory in this. And I think that's the difference. That's why this has such a powerful and important place in the Gospel of John. That this is something that his people needed to understand and see it borne out in real life. And when Jesus intentionally gets up from the meal to break the train of thought and make this point, they can't miss it. They've been talking and arguing with one another about who's the most important. And now the one who is most important is down on his knees washing feet. Jamie.
For me, that is the most powerful and poignant phrase that we read in the Bible. This is before his death. Now he's going to bring his death. This is what he wants them. You know, that, you know, and it goes against even in our, you know, that humility, that humbleness that our Lord expects us to have because he's
Absolutely. This is not what was expected. It's not what we expect. But it is who Jesus was. And here's the important thing. It shows us his mind. It shows us why he does everything that he does. It shows... Yeah. That's right. That's right. Lamar?
It was so ingrained, he wanted to drive the point home that he created an object lesson that they would never forget. He could have just told them, but by doing the act, they will never forget that moment.
That image has to be just seared into their consciousness. It just has, it has to be. And they cannot forget it. You're right. You're right. So, this is how Jesus showed the full extent of his love. And it showed his willingness to die, to deny himself in the service of others. And it's a premonition of the service that he will soon render on the cross as he expands his audience, not to just the 12, including Judas, but also to all of mankind and how he serves them. And most of all, it shows us the mind of God's Messiah and what he intends and why he did it. One last thought, Jamie?
One other, this is one thing, and then there's one other area that really hits me, is when Jesus is being accused, and he never opens his mouth. Like a thief, he was led to slaughter. The fact that God himself does not defend himself. And I think there's been so many times where you're in a situation, and you're praying for the Lord to help you through it, and that memory, that thought that Jesus did not, he was not guilty, but he did not defend himself. That we don't have to say anything, that we can leave it with God. So between that servant and then the other knowledge that we don't have to defend ourselves, God will defend us. At some point, maybe not right that second, but it will come through.
It's not about, and we see this in the life of Jesus so poignantly, it's not about what we say, it's not about talk, it's about who we are and what we do. That's what it's all about. And that's the question that we have to take with us. Who am I? And what am I going to do? Do it my way, his way. God is good. Yes, he is.